Well, hello, Stephen. It's great to be able to connect with you today. And you're in London.
Indeed, we're bridging, a large part of the country. I'm in North London. You're in a beautiful Anglesey, and I can say that because I have had the pleasure of visiting Anglesey a few years ago, and it is a beautiful part of the world.
And it's certainly beautiful today with the sun shining. Well, for anyone that's listening on YouTube, Stephen, I got to connect with Stephen through the Shalom Declaration. I'm a Christian. I'm pastor of a church here in North Wales, and Stephen is from the Jewish community. So I'm going to ask Stephen, would you like to tell us something about your background and how you came to be involved in the Shalom Declaration and what it is? And because this is all about Jewish-Christian relations, and you want to talk a bit about the perception that Jews have of Christians, and also about the roots of what we call the Jewish roots of our faith, so we can help to it can help for us to understand one another a bit better.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for this opportunity and this conversation. I think it's hugely important, both from a Jewish and Christian perspective, that we reach out in friendship, and we have a lot to learn from each other. I grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, just on the opposite side of the Irish Sea to where you are. And Northern Ireland was always a very strong evangelical Christian tradition in Belfast, where I grew up. So I always had Christian friends. As a member of a very small Jewish community over there in Northern Ireland. Today we're talking about 70 or 80 members of the synagogue in Belfast. So we were a tiny community, and I went to a school. It was from a Protestant tradition, a very strong Christian union in the school. So I always had that engagement and friendship, which perhaps many of my colleagues in the Jewish community didn't have if they were growing up in the bigger Jewish centres, maybe in northwest London or in Manchester. They're a bit more self-contained, the Jewish communities there. So that was always something that I was personally interested in. I was a lawyer for many, many years, but when I went into community work almost 10 years ago, I really felt it was important to reach out from the Jewish community to the churches, and in particular, those part of the churches that wish to stand with the Jewish people regarding Israel in particular. And the Shalom Declaration was an initiative which reached out to churches right across the British Isles, literally from Shetland down to Jersey, from Northern Ireland in the west, right across to East Anglia. And I was touched that over 200 different churches, prayer groups, ministries wanted to sign the Shalom Declaration, which was really paying homage to what we share, which is a love of Hebrew scripture, a love of the land of Israel, and to stand up against anti-Semitism and extremism in the world today. Of course, so many Christians facing harsh persecution in the world today. So I thought it was extremely important to bring Jews and Christians together on that kind of shared platform. And I was very touched when the church in Anglesey reached out and said, we want to sign the Shalom Declaration. I never take that kind of support for granted. It's hugely, hugely appreciated. Today, I'm also working for an organization called Magen David Adom, which is Israel's national medical emergency service. And there's a very strong Christian Friends of Magen David Adom, which supports Israel's ambulance service, for instance. And there are ambulances in Israel, if you've ever go and visit there, and you can see dedicated on the side of the ambulance, it will say, this ambulance was paid for by Christian Friends of Magen David Adom. The Jewish community is also very supportive, of course, but that Christian support, I think, is really important for Israelis to see that there are Christians in the world out there who wish to stand with them in a very, very practical way.
Yeah, well, I think that's a wonderful thing, and I certainly count it a privilege to be able to talk with you and share with you. And I believe it's very significant at this time that Jews and Christians can get to understand one another better. But it hasn't always been like that, has it? Because I remember when I first went to Israel, that I sensed there was quite a lot of suspicion of Christians, and understandably with all the history. Would you like to say something about that, and how did Jewish people today perceive Christians, would you say?
So that there's about 14 million Jews in the world today, roughly, and there's an old saying, Philip, two Jews, three opinions.
Yes,
Have you heard
yes,
that? Very
yes.
argumentative to people. So I could never claim to speak for
No.
all Jews and what their attitudes to Christians might be. But I think, you alluded to a legacy, a history in this relationship. It's a 2,000-year relationship. Go right back to the beginning, and Jews persecuted the early church. That's on record. From quite an early stage, the boot was on the other foot, and the church has a very sad history. And I know many Christians feel this very keenly in terms of a legacy of contempt for Jews and Judaism within a church tradition. And that manifests itself in many ways in the Middle Ages and ghettos, in Inquisition, in expulsion of Jews from various parts of the world, including England, of course. And take it to more modern times, anti-Semitism perhaps took a different form in the 20th century. It became a radical racial hatred of Jews, but it built on a legacy of exclusion and persecution, which was already there. I'm talking, of course, about the Nazi period, but persecution of Jews goes back much deeper and much further than that. So, of course, it leaves a legacy. And I think for many Jews, there's an apprehension about the church. They wouldn't, perhaps many Jewish people perhaps wouldn't understand that there are many different kinds of Christians, different denominations, different outlooks, different points of view about Israel and the Jewish people. They might regard the church as being, one of the mainstream churches like the Catholic Church or the Church of England. They perhaps would not know that there is, not a huge amount of knowledge on the part of many, many Jews. So there's an element of apprehension. It's quite deep-seated. So if I would explain to Jewish colleagues and Jewish friends the work that I do, one of the initial responses I often get is, well, what is their agenda? With these Christians who want to stand with us, what really motivates them? And what they're talking about there is, I think, a certain viewpoint, perhaps, that the church, in their view, has always hated us and always will hate us. But there's also, I think, a fear that Christianity has an agenda. It is a faith that I know takes very seriously the responsibility to proclaim its gospel, its truth. But there is a fear amongst Christians of kind of proselytism, fear amongst Jews that Christians are seeking only to proselytize and can never really be friends, and there can never really be respect and trust. Now, these are very difficult and complex issues, but I think in our day there is a huge move towards friendship. In other words, the conversation that we're having today may not have been possible even 10, 15 years ago, not very likely. Not just that technology has permitted it, but also attitudes have changed.
Yeah.
I think we see this in so many ways of Jews and Christians standing together, shared principles, shared challenges, and as you've alluded to, really learning from each other regarding so much of our shared biblical heritage.
Yeah, well, that is that's really wonderful, and I mean that there is a long history and of persecution from people that were called Christians against the Jews, and I've even heard that Hitler was, as he was a baptized Roman Catholic, of course he would get associated with Christianity, which is very sad. But I sense things are changing, and slowly. And as you say, that this conversation may not have been possible a few years back. And so it is wonderful that we can look at our common heritage. And one of those things that I'm particularly interested in, because from my side, I feel there's a real lack of understanding amongst many Christians concerning the Bible and our Jewish heritage, the Jewish roots of Christianity. And this is, for example, take the communion service. And we often like to explain when we have communion in our church that this does come from the Passover. And I think in many Christian circles, they don't even recognize that that has Jewish roots. So I wondered if we could just talk for a bit. I could ask you about, from your perception, how you understand the Pesach, the Passover, and as you mentioned earlier, we'll probably only have time to cover a couple of these, but as I understand it, the main feasts, the Jewish feasts that the Jewish males were required to attend the temple in Jerusalem were Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. So could we touch on maybe a couple of those then? We've recently been through Passover, haven't we? And just a week or so ago, Pentecost. And again, Pentecost, many Christians don't realize the Jewish connection there. So it'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, the amazing thing, Philip, is that these are biblical feasts.
Yeah.
Commandments that God gave right back in the giving of the Torah, and it said in the Torah that these feasts would be for all time, and you will celebrate them wherever you are. So there was me, Jew, living in Belfast in the late 20th century, and I was keeping these festivals which God commanded us so many thousands of years ago. So that there is that biblical connection to these festivals, and we can look back and see what the Bible actually says about them. We've just had Shavuot, as you've said. It's translated as the Feast of Weeks, and that's because the Bible commands us to count the weeks from the Passover to the Pentecost. Pentecost, of course, means 50. It's from the Greek. And so once you've counted your 7 complete weeks from Passover, you come to the 50th day, and in the Jewish calendar, that is the festival of Shavuot, of the Feast of Weeks, which is also known as Pentecost. And the Bible tells us what those Jewish males were doing that you've mentioned, obligated to visit Jerusalem. And it mentions the sacrifices that were brought both in the temple as communal sacrifices, and also a particular feature of Pentecost was the first fruits that the farmer brought. So these are agricultural festivals. It's also known as the Harvest Festival. This is the wheat harvest in the land of Israel to this day. And the farmer brought his best fruits. When you go to the supermarket and they'll say, top quality fruit, that's what you are obliged to bring, the very best of your crop as an offering of joy and thanksgiving. And I know Christians take the harvest festivals that they have very much as a time of thanksgiving to God, the ultimate provider. And this was a reminder to the farmer that it wasn't just his efforts that brought the crop, but it was through the gratitude to what the Lord had provided. So that's a very important agricultural aspect of the Shavuot festival. It was the time of the wheat harvest. But there's more than that, because although this isn't stated in the Torah expressly, in the rabbinic Jewish tradition, Pentecost is the giving of the law. We say in Hebrew, Zaman Matan Toratenu, the season of the giving of the law. And we believe it was that 50-day period from the Passover, the historic experience of the children of Israel leaving Egypt. And then at the end of this period, they arrive at Mount Sinai and they receive the 10 Commandments from God on Mount Sinai. So that this festival is intimately connected to what in the Jewish faith would be considered the marriage, if you like, a marriage ceremony between Israel and God, with the giving of the Ten Commandments marking it. So that impacts on our celebration of Shavuot to this day. We would, for instance, just a little symbols of it. In our synagogues, when we were able to gather in our synagogues, we had flowers to decorate the synagogue to remind us of the vegetation on the slopes of Mount Sinai. So it's a very happy festival. We eat. All Jewish festivals have an element around food. What we particularly eat during Pentecost and Shavuot is dairy food. So we have very nice cheesecake on Shavuot. It's I guess because it's a summer festival, and in Israel in particular, it would be very hot. So rather than having heavy meat meals, which is normal for festivals, it's a dairy cuisine on the festival of Shavuot. And should I talk a little bit about Passover, because the two festivals
yes, please.
are connected?
Yeah.
I mean, the point you made, Philip, about understanding, the Christian narrative and how important the understanding of the Jewish backgrounds of this feast are, I think is very clear in terms of Passover, because you have the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. Why was he in Jerusalem? Well, as you've said, it was a pilgrim festival. The city was crowded. There would have been hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, you're right, male pilgrims in those days, absolutely. And then the story in the New Testament about how they found the room to have their Last Supper, because people coming into Jerusalem at that time, there were no great hotel chains in those days. You relied on the hospitality of the Jerusalem residents to bring you in, and so a room was needed. And the Last Supper and how that corresponds with the Jewish Seder, because it's very, I think, significant about Passover in the Jewish tradition is that it's a festival that's celebrated primarily in the home, not in the synagogue or equivalent church. It's the Seder night with the family around you on the eve of Passover. So on the night of Passover, we have the Seder, which is very rich, excuse me, in symbolism, and you've alluded, I think, to the wine and the matzah, the unleavened bread, the wafer, which of course has huge significance in Christian tradition and in Christian communion, and that is part of our Seder to this day. We also eat bitter herbs to remind us of the bitterness of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. We have something called charoset, which is a mixture of apples, wine, nuts, and this is to remind us of the mortar. It doesn't taste like mortar, not the mortar, but it's got that kind of constituency to remind us again. It's a symbol of the slavery. And the matzah, the unleavened bread, which I know many non-Jewish people eat throughout the year, it's become something which you can buy in the kind of mainstream supermarkets these days. Well, the matzah symbolizes two different things. One is it's the bread of the poor man, so it's what the slaves ate in Egypt, but it also commemorates the haste by which the children of Israel had to leave. So therefore they didn't have time to bake bread. So this eating of the matzah is a very important part of the festival of the Passover. In fact, the Torah calls it Chag HaMatzot, which means the festival of the unleavened bread. That is the name of the festival in the Torah. So these are festivals which commemorate historical events, but in the Jewish custom, we have to relive those events. In other words, for us, the revelation at Mount Sinai isn't just an historic event which took place, I don't know, 3,500 years ago. We have to believe we were there. We were there at Mount Sinai receiving the Torah. We were there in Egypt when God took us out from bondage and slavery, surrounded by miracles. We have to make our children curious and ask the questions, particularly during Passover. This is it's an experience. It's not just a reading a narrative or saying set prayers. You have to experience that, and how we pass that on to our children is the crucial part of Passover. And the Torah mentions on a number of occasions, say this to your son when your son asks. So it's a narrative that is passed down from generation to generation. So it's a very, you will find Jews who perhaps wouldn't be seen inside a synagogue one year to the next. Perhaps they're very secular, very liberal-minded or whatever. But they will be wanting to be at the Seder because it's something which transcends, I think, religious formality. It's who you are. It gets to your very essence. Who's important to you. And I think we all feel this now during this period of coming out of lockdown that we're speaking in. What's important to us? Family, our loved ones, our relationship with the Almighty, because so much of our time is spent chasing after, shopping, chasing after consumer goods, going to the football match, whatever it is we really enjoyed doing in so-called normal times. It's all been taken away from us over these last few weeks, and we're rediscovering what's really fundamentally important to us. So I think that was the key to the Jewish festivals all along. Take you out of your working life. We're not allowed to work during the festivals. The Torah tells us desist from work. We take this to quite strong extremes. We don't watch television during the festivals. We may not put on electric lights or things like that. It takes us out of the everyday humdrum life, which we thought was so important, and brings us into another world, in the case of the festivals, connection with the Almighty.
Wonderful. Well, I think that is amazing. In fact, there's such a lot there. We'll have to do another one of these, because there's not only a lot to say about those, but there's a lot more feasts to cover. But I think it's very interesting that Passover is celebrated in the home. It is a family occasion, and the children are involved, and so that causes me to be a bit sad, really, the way communion has become in many churches. But I think there's a growing revelation amongst many Christians that we can that my wife and I, we have communion in our home very often, and we encourage other people to do that, and we remember it does come from the Jewish Passover, which is when Jesus was with his disciples, and he said, "This is my body and my blood," and so on. And obviously Christians see it in a different way, but I think that's amazing. One thing I didn't know was about the cheesecake at Pentecost. I'll remember that next time.
So, delicious, I have to say. Not perhaps great for people who want to lose weight. But it's a nice touch. As I've said, it's a summer festival, so it's nice to have a lighter dairy cuisine at that time of year.
And I think what you said about not doing any work during the festivals, which also is the same as the Jewish Sabbath, it is very important today that we take times out, because life is so busy. And perhaps one thing we've learned in this lockdown is the need for these times of reflection and times to abstain from work and the normal things, because our bodies need that. And God, our Creator, knew what we needed. And also the harvest. I think, again, with all that the way we buy things on the internet now, I think maybe many children growing up don't realize that seeds have to go in the ground. Everything we eat comes from a seed, doesn't it, really, apart from the meat? And it's God. The Bible tells us it's God who gives life to that seed and causes it to grow. The farmer does his work, but without that creative power within the seed, we wouldn't have any food. So it's so right we give thanks to God for that. Well, it's been wonderful to have this conversation, Stephen, with you. And as I say, we'll have to do do that again, and our time's running out, so I'll just click off the